All right, welcome everybody. So I am Laura Johnson, and we are doing The Gifts of Imperfection, which is a Brene Brown book. It looks like this. This is one of her older books, one of her beginning books, and one of my favorites of hers, actually, because I relate so much to the imperfections of humanity and seeing all of my imperfections all of the time. So, a little bit about me. I'm a certified life coach. This is what I do for a living. I help Christian moms answer what they feel called to do. I believe we all have a God-given purpose here on this earth, and it's my job to help you become the person that you want to be and the person that God is calling you to be. So the reason why I do these book clubs is because I love books. I love women. I love bringing us all together to talk about very specific things that every single one of us can do right now to answer that calling within and become who we're meant to be, which is one of the reasons why I love this book, The Gifts of Imperfection. So to kind of start with, I always love to share, like, you're in the right place based on these things. So first, if you're busy and you don't always have time to read the book, that's one reason, you're in the right place for that. The other thing is if it feels like everybody else has their life figured out except for you, or they all seem put together, or all their kids seem really well behaved, and you feel like they have some secret sauce that you don't have. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. If you always have this thought, I need to do blank better, or I need to do blank more. So if you have a thought like, I need to exercise, I need to organize, I need to declutter, I need to cook more, I need to manage my time better, all of those things. If you've ever had some of those thoughts, you're in the right place. Another one, if you are always asking other people's opinions, and if you're researching for things for hours, but you're not making a decision and moving on beyond it. And that's a really common thing where we have so much information at our fingertips, yet we're stuck in so much indecision in our lives. So we're going to talk about that. There's another really important one. If you take a picture of yourself with your kids and you look at it and you spend more time critically analyzing the way you look than you do being in the joy of the moment of the picture. Or if you walk by a mirror and you're like staring at your butt, or you're like, oh, these little areas of me don't look like they used to. And all of a sudden you walk by the mirror and you catch yourself like glancing a little bit longer, but you're not staring at yourself. You're actually staring down at your body. So that's another thing. Another thing, you're in the right place is if your self-care doesn't feel rejuvenating, meaning if you're watching a TV show and at the end you're having the thought, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done X, Y, and Z. Why did I do that? And then you start beating yourself up over something that could be otherwise relaxing. So you can go over to the chat box and tell me if any of those stood out to you and if there's something that you notice yourself doing. All of these, and I will say the reason why I could write these so easily was because I struggle with them too, because I'm an imperfect human. But all of these are a sign that you lack love for who you are and you haven't embraced her yet. We can never answer our God-given calling until we accept who we are right now, and and we're going to talk about how we do that. But everybody needs to recognize and create a space of self-love. And that comes from embracing our imperfections. So before we can ever answer that calling, this is the first step to all of it. So what Brene Brown talks about in the book and how to resolve this is to learn from a place of what she calls wholehearted living. And she uses this phrase many times in this book, where the phrase itself comes from this belief that we are enough, that we are worthy of love, that we are worthy of joy and happiness. This wholehearted living is a place of like living in the next register of life, where it's a full body experience, where you come alive. This is the way to answer whatever it is that you feel called to do and to live from a place of joy and gratitude for the rest of your life. Now, one of the things that I see all the time in my clients is, okay, this is the way it shows up in their brain. Okay, so if I'm living from this wholehearted living and I'm believing that I'm enough, I will have no motivation to ever change, because there are things that we want to grow and evolve and change in our lives, and that's okay. But our brain has this thought error where we get caught on, if we believe that I am enough, then it will never result in change. But I wanted you to think about this in a different way, because this is a false belief. This doesn't actually work. So think about it this way, okay? We've all had that boss that feels like they're talking down to us. And when that happens, we start to feel very small. This does not feel good. And there may be change that happens here if your boss is constantly like barking orders at you. Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a friend. You know, we all know those people that make that we start to feel very small when we're around. We're not that motivated. And it feels very discouraging in the changes that we are making. When we have this belief that we're not enough, that we need to always be doing better, we are essentially barking orders at our inner child. And this is what will stop us dead in our tracks every single time. So I want you to think about it this way, that wholehearted living, developing this belief that I am enough and that it will create lasting change, is essentially like walking hand in hand with yourself. You'll find out really quick that I'm horrible at drawing. If you're new, then yes, you'll know. Like that poor, she is happy. She doesn't look happy right there. But you're walking hand in hand with yourself when you're developing that love and that belief that I am enough. So think about somebody in your life. Oh, you know what? Actually, hold on real quick. I just realized there. Okay, now we're on speaker view, so the recording might look a little funny at the beginning of this. I apologize for that. So when you're walking hand in hand with each other, you're walking in partnership with yourself, with that love, but also in partnership with God. He's the one that created you. You are a spectacular human being, and now you have the opportunity to make changes in your life from this place of you are worthy of being loved. And Brene Brown talks about this through her whole book, through this wholehearted living. So when we talk about this, this is the visual that I want you to think back to, is I'm walking in partnership with myself. So let's go back to the whole phrase, a gift of imperfection. So why do we have imperfection? I think it's really important for every single one of us to recognize what is the purpose of an imperfection. And I was thinking about this and what she talks about. And the thing that really stood out to me is that imperfections are God's greatest equalizer, that it is the common string through every bit of humanity. Every single one of us are imperfect. And when we recognize those imperfections, we are leaning on God more in our lives. And Brene Brown talks about this a lot in her book, where that spirituality, that there is something greater than us, that this is the commonality that we all share with one another. That's what connects us as humans and allows us to have greater courage and compassion. And so this is what she talks about, is the greatest lie that we have with regards to our imperfections is, this is only me. Like, I'm the only one that's imperfect. I'm the only one that screws all this up. That is the greatest lie. But on the flip side, the greatest truth that we have is that every one of us is imperfect, and that we can embrace those imperfections. And it allows for us to have greater connection, greater courage, and greater compassion, the 3 C's, with every bit of humanity. And this is how we cultivate the ultimate worthiness, not by being perfect, but by using the gifts of imperfection for these 3 things to happen. So she talks about these 3 words in the book, and I think it's important to clarify what they mean. So she talks about connection as being seen, valued, and heard. And that is very vulnerable. It's scary. It's scary for people to see the real us. I can relate to that. I probably spent the first, I don't know, 35 years of my life built with like a 6-foot barricade around myself. I did not want anybody to see and hear my authentic self because I was scared of what would happen. And it was like I was living a lie based on always trying to please other people. But what also happened was that I kept people at 6 feet arm's length at all times. And I lacked that human connection, and being that connection kept me so distant, and I couldn't experience true joy from that place because I was living a very solo life. That's a hard place to see, a hard place to live from. And so when we're embracing our imperfections and we're allowing our wall to start to come down, that's when we experience greater connection. If you want to learn more about this, the book club where we did Daring Greatly, which is also Brene Brown's book, we dive more into connection and vulnerability and how to work through that. We'll talk a little bit about it today, but the Daring Greatly replay goes more into that, and I'll link to it. So the other thing she talks about is courage. And one of the quotes she says in there is, you get courage by couraging, meaning like if you want to become a runner, you have to run. If you want to be a swimmer, you have to swim. If you want to be a courager, you have to courage. And the only way to do that is to feel the emotions of fear and all of those things that start to come up, and be that vulnerable self and putting yourself out there and sharing your experiences with other people. This does not mean you have to go wave your dirty laundry on social media. Okay. Let's be very clear. That is not encouraging, but encouraging may be sitting down with a friend and expressing some of the challenges that you're experiencing in your life. This was very hard for me to do recently. We had, my son was in the hospital and I had to ask for help, and that was hard. I am not one that likes asking for help. And we'll talk more about that in a second as well. But I had to reach out to some very close friends and really explain what was happening. And that took a lot of courage for me to do. But the more I put myself out there, the more I share my experiences, the more courage I start to gain. And that is one of the ways that I am embracing my imperfections more. The next one is compassion. And I love the definition she has for compassion, and it's to suffer with. And this always comes from a place of being equal. Okay. So again, going back to this picture, like the partnership where we are on the same playing field. That is very different than what most of us get stuck in. We are okay with giving help. We have a much harder time receiving help. But she talks about when we put ourselves in that space where we're okay to give, but not okay to receive, we are creating a lack of compassion. Subconsciously, we are judging other people when they ask for help if we are not willing to ask for help for ourselves. When we're using connection, courage, and compassion, we are creating that partnership, that equality among us, where we will all be the giver and receiver at some point in our lives. And this is where we really start to lean into the gifts of imperfection and seeing humanity from a very different level. So this is the basics of it. Okay. These are the gifts that come from imperfection, being able to rely on Jesus Christ, on God the Father. This comes from seeing our imperfections. But in order to do that, like we have, every single one of us has a biological need for love and belonging. We can put ourselves out there all day long, but if we're not feeling that love and belonging, all of this will just go by the wayside. And so that's the next part where she talks about in her book, where the next step is to recognize the challenges of owning our story, of loving our story, and letting go of what other people think of us. That's where we find love and belonging. Okay. So love and belonging, and that comes from owning our story, and it comes from letting go excuse me, that's letting go of what others think. Looks really easy when we write it down, right? Well, wouldn't we all love to do that? I mean, that's super simple when we write it out, very difficult when we apply it. And I really want you to consider this for yourself, that this is where love and belonging exists, is when we do the hard work to practice these two things. And so there is a part where I wanted to read this in the book because I think it's important for us to recognize the definitions of both of these words. So love, she talks about, love is not something we give or get, which is very different than the beliefs I've had for a long time about it. Love is not something we give or get. It is something we nurture and grow. A connection that can only be cultivated between two people when it exists within each one of us. Okay, I want you to really hear that, write that down. Love is a connection that can only be cultivated between two people when it exists within each one of us. We can only love others as much as we love ourselves. And I think about that with the scriptures. When I think about, in the Bible, it talks about the first greatest commandment is to love God with all of our heart, might, mind, and strength. The second is to love others as we love ourselves. And I think that's so important. It's not more than self. It's not less than self. It is as we love ourselves. And that's exactly what she talks about in this book, that in order for us to become the greatest versions, the people that God has always seen and wanted for us, we have to cultivate that love for ourselves. And when we do that, that's when we start to own our own story. So let's look at this word belonging, because this is also really fascinating. She talks about belonging is the innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. True belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. That's hard, right? Because in order for all of us to truly feel like we belong, we have to first accept who we are. And when we start to do that accept that imperfect being, that's when we create that connection and that shared humanity. So she goes on to say, practicing self-love means learning how to trust ourselves, how to treat ourselves with respect, and to be kind and affectionate toward ourselves. And so she talks about how we have to, it's not just professing love to ourselves, it's actually practicing love. So let's talk for just a second on how we do that, because I think that's, like we said, it's easier said than done. And we'll go more into detail in just a second, but I've got kids. You hear a lot of, my oldest is 10, and you start looking forward to what are some of the challenges of the teenage years. And we hear the phrase self-harm a lot. And I've been thinking about this as I was learning about self-love and belonging and all of these things, and what I teach my clients and all of that. And I think how interesting it is that every single time we think about self-harm, we think about physical. We think about the actual things that we are doing to our physical state. But how many of us live in verbal self-harm? Okay, when we really are walking by the mirror and tearing ourselves apart. So the general rule of thumb when I think about this for myself is, if I wouldn't say it to one of my children, or if I wouldn't say it to a dear friend, I don't get to say it to myself. And it's not stopping that. It's watching when I do it and apologizing to myself when I do. And so that's one thing that we can do as we're practicing that self-love. Apologizing. I'm a really great speller until I'm on camera and then I struggle. So when we're noticing these behaviors starting to happen, one of the things that you can do very quickly is notice when you do it and apologize to yourself, just as you would a friend if you ever said something hurtful to her. So, and this leads into the next thing where she says, what is the main thing that gets in the way of us being able to love and belong to ourselves first and then to other people? And she talks about that as shame. And again, if you want to learn more about shame and vulnerability, Daring Greatly does go deeper into that. And you can find that. I'll post to it so that you can see the recording if you haven't read the full book. So she talks about how shame is something that we all have. It's the part of us that wants to shrink and hide. When something happens, it's almost like the reaction of our body is we want to coil back very quickly. That is a sign of shame. And the way it's like the default setting of every human brain. Now, when she talks about this in the book, she says, I want to get clear on the difference between shame and guilt. Okay, so a lot of people think that they're the same, but she separates the two of these, where guilt is, I did something bad. So it's more focused on behavior. And it can actually be very motivating. Like, I want to make amends. Okay. There's more desire there. And the way I think about this is like godly sorrow. Like, God wants us to ask for forgiveness. He wants us to apologize. He wants us to try and do better, not from a place of like, you're the scum of the earth, but hey, I know you can do better. Let's do that. So this is where that guilt can be very motivating. This is where I believe, that comes from God. Whereas shame, I believe, comes from Satan. Again, this is one of the greatest lies. And it feels very different. It feels very despairing. It feels like you want to coil back and you want to hide. This is the difference of I am bad. And when we start to internalize this, and you can see this, it's important for you to learn it for yourself, but to also learn it for your children, because you'll see the difference, because they'll have an immediate reaction when they are in shame, and typically they get very angry, or they shut down almost instantly. Notice when you do the same thing. Now, when we're looking at this, this is where the verbal self-harm starts to come in. Like, you are an idiot. I can't believe you did that. That's so embarrassing. How could you? That's the kind of language that exists when we start doing the verbal self-harm versus, hey, let's look at this. Let's try and do better. Hey, let's look at this. I want to make this better. See how different it sounds to make it better. This will sound much more positive, and there's still emotions that exist here, but it's one that will propel you forward instead of to stop you dead in your tracks for months, maybe even years. And when we get to this point, she talks about shame resiliency. She said, in order to develop that shame resiliency, not non-existent shame will always happen as humans, but to become resilient, to be able to rebuild yourself when you are in shame, she gives us very specific things to do. The first one is to name it. I am feeling shame right now. The second one is to talk about it. And that's hard. And she talks a lot about that in the book, on how we can seek out people who have earned the right to hear our story, who have earned our trust, so that we can reach out to them and share these shameful moments. When we get to that space, when we name it, when we talk about it, then we own it as part of who we are. That's when shame starts to loosen its grip on us. Shame will always exist in secrecy. Shame wants to live in secrecy. And the longer we stay in secrecy about it, the more control it will have over us. This is when your imperfections become all-consuming to you. You can stay in the gift aspect when you are looking from a place of guilt. I'm like, I know I can do better. I am a really fantastic person, and I'm going to work on this. Very different experience. So those are the basics of the gifts of imperfections. Then she gives us 10 guideposts. And some of these we'll spend a couple more minutes on than others. You can go through, even if you look at, let me find it real quick. If you do have the book, if you look at just the table of contents, she goes through and lists these out. Even without reading the book, you can write down those guideposts and recognize and sit with each one of those, or even if you read a section at a time. So I'm going to write out just a couple of them. We're going to talk about them. But as I do that, I want you to go over to the chat box. Tell me something that stood out to you from this first little bit that we talked about. Maybe it's something that you recognize you do. Maybe it's something that you want to work on. Just while I write down a couple of these first ones. Okay. Okay, so again, if you have a second, if you're able to go over to the chat box. Okay, so I think, Corey, you had mentioned this before, always thinking I need to be better. Yes, that is something we all do. Yeah. There's always something that we can be working on. We'll talk about the difference between self-improvement and self-deprecation, always thinking that we need to do something better. Okay, so you can go over to the chat box, share anything else that has stood out to you so far. So what I want to talk about with these two, these are probably the ones that we'll spend the most time on out of the guideposts, because I think it's really relevant for every single one of us. She talks about cultivating authenticity. Oh, real quick, before you do that, I'm going to read Robin's. Letting go of what others think of me, making a change when something isn't working for me, not going along with the crowd. It's a very natural thing. And we'll talk about that in just a second, how when we want to belong, there's a difference between belonging and there's a belonging and fitting in. And when we're really stuck on what other people think of us, we become a chameleon and try to fit in versus loving and belonging and owning our own story. So that's a perfect segue, actually. Thank you, Robin, into cultivating our authenticity. So she talks about cultivating our authenticity. It's a choice that we make every single day. And she calls it the audacity of authenticity. And I really like that phrase, where we go against the crowd to be ourselves. And it feels very scary to our brain, because we're inviting people to see the real version of us. And when we're making that conscious choice to put out our authentic self, that's again where we start to feel vulnerable, and our brain it's almost like our brain will start saying, abort, 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 get out. Like, this is dangerous. I want you to stay with that and feel the emotion, even when you're scared, and have the courage to show up from that authentic place. So the next one she talks about is cultivating self-compassion. And we know that we are lacking self-compassion if we are living in the land of perfectionism. So she says shame is the birthplace of perfectionism. So I want you to think about this for yourself, because this is something that I would call an epidemic in our society, where we use perfectionism as a way to describe ourselves. I'm a perfectionist. Perfectionism is just who I am. These are all phrases I've heard from my clients. And I myself, as a recovering perfectionism, I could write the 12 steps on it. But I think it's really interesting to think about, instead of saying I'm a perfectionist, say I'm somebody that likes to hide in shame. I'm really great at shaming myself. That's essentially the same thing, that every single time we say I'm a perfectionist, we're really saying I'm great at shaming myself. And so when we get to that place, and I'm going to read from the book, because this is something I see so prevalent. When we get to a place of wanting to move forward in what we feel called to do, we get so stuck in what she calls life paralysis. She says she calls life paralysis as all the opportunities we miss because we're too afraid to put anything out in the world that could be imperfect. Really let that sink in. Life paralysis comes from perfectionism, and that's all the opportunities that we miss out on when we're too afraid to put anything out into the world that could be imperfect. So she goes on to say that perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is not healthy achievement and growth. Perfectionism is the belief that if we look perfect and if we act perfect, we minimize the pain that comes from shame. So shame is always going to come from ourselves. It's that despair that I believe actually comes from Satan, and it makes us want to hide. So we put on this perfectionism front in order to minimize the pain of what other people might think. It goes back to this authenticity, is we can't truly be ourselves when we're trying to be a perfectionist because we're more focused on what other people think. So she said, perfectionism, again, is not self-improvement. Perfectionism at its core is about trying to earn the approval and acceptance of others. Most perfectionists were raised being praised for achievement and performance, grades, manners, rule following, people pleasing, appearance, sports. Somewhere along the way, we adopt this dangerous and debilitating belief system. I am what I accomplish and how well I accomplish it. Please perform perfect. Healthy striving is focused on how can I improve? Perfectionism is focused on what will they think? That's big, okay? And to really let that all sink in for just a second, that perfectionism is focused on what will others think. Self-improvement is focused on how can I improve? How can I be better? How can I be in partnership with God? So she goes on to say perfectionism is a self-destructive and addictive belief system. And it's fueled by this thought: if I look perfect, live perfect, and do everything perfect, I can minimize painful feelings. Perfectionism is self-destructive simply because there's no such thing as perfect. It's an unattainable goal. She says it's also addictive because when we invariably do experience shame, judgment, and blame, we often believe it's because we're not perfect enough. And I think that right there is such a key, is that negative emotions will show up no matter what we do. Okay. That's just human life. We are going to feel positive and we're going to feel negative emotions always, regardless of what goal you reach, regardless of how much weight you lose, regardless of what calling, how good of a mother you are, any of those things. Positive and negative emotions will show up at every phase of your life. I've tried to prove this wrong. I promise you I have. And it will always be there, always. But the difference is when you are stuck in perfectionism and you lack self-compassion, when you feel negative emotions, you think it's because you are not good enough. That is the flaw in the belief system. That is why it is so destructive. So she says, in order to, I'm going to just erase this to give us more room. In order to develop that self-compassion, we have to first recognize self-kindness. Again, this goes back to what I said. If you wouldn't say it to a friend or your child, you are not allowed to say it to yourself. End of story. And when you notice yourself doing it, you apologize for treating yourself in such a horrible manner, because you are a child of God and you are worthy exactly how you are. So that's the first one. The second one is recognizing that it's our common link to humanity, that every single person, when they behave in a horrible way, it's always a reflection of the shame that they feel. Every single person feels that. That is, again, not to say that their behavior is acceptable by any means. You still have boundaries in place, but to recognize that it's something every single one of us have. And then to recognize, oh, you're actually going to see one of my kids here in just a second. Hey, just wait a second, okay? Hold on, real quick. Hey, I'm on a call. I'll be back in just a second. Okay. Well, no, I have people right here. Do you want to see? Okay. I'm going to show you my daughter. Come here. Look, I have all these people right here. Look. And that's my niece. Isn't she cute? There's my niece. They got to dress up for Halloween today. Mom. So she is Carly Quinn. I need you to wait.
Hold on, I have to ask you a important
Okay,
question.
we're not doing sleepover. Okay.
No.
I do apologize. Hold on.
They could probably take me to my therapist.
Okay, we will talk in just a second. Okay, thank you. Okay, have her, do you know my phone number? Have her text me.
Okay.
Okay. So we had some change of plans today, apparently, because she's supposed to be with somebody right now. So you get to see, this is really what my life is like. This is what it means to be a mom and to be a life coach. Okay, so we talk about the common humanity. We talk about how every single one of us experiences it, but also the mindfulness aspect of it, on being able to tap into our body, to be able to sit and be with ourselves and to develop that kindness. So these three things are how we really work through that shame. And again, go back to Daring Greatly, where we talk more about that shame resilience. So then the third thing, so you can go over, tell me what stood out to you out of those two things. The others, we're going to move a little bit quicker. But the next one is to cultivate a resilient spirit. When we cultivate this resilient spirit, she talks about letting go of numbing. And I will tell you that I could have a PhD in what it means to numb because it's one of my favorite things to do. You will know when you are numbing, when you sit in front of a show and it's like your mind just feels like it's turned off. You will also know if you're numbing because you'll have things that you want to do, but you're scrolling on your phone and you just can't stop. It's like you can't look away. You'll also know if you're numbing if you pick up a really good book. I mean, it's not a bad thing to read a book, but suddenly you're telling your kids they have to leave you alone and you're so sucked into this book. These are all examples of what numbing is. Numbing is when we try to shut down our brain so it doesn't have to feel emotions in our body. And we, in order to overcome this is where our goals go to die, just to be clear. Like everything that we want to do, numbing will stop us dead in our tracks when we're doing that. And it's learning how to feel the emotions instead of going to a place of needing to numb them. And this is what will happen. She talks about how in order to work through this, we have to develop hope. And I liked her definition of hope that I'm going to read for you as well. Let me see if I've got it right here. Shoot, I might have accidentally. Hold on. I don't know if I put it in there. So she says that she always thought hope was an emotion, like a warm feeling of optimism or possibility. She was wrong. Hope is not an emotion. It's a way of thinking or a cognitive process within our brain. Hope happens when we have the ability to set realistic goals, when we figure out how to achieve those goals and have the ability to stay flexible and develop alternate routes, and when we believe in ourselves. She said, hope is a combination of setting goals, having the tenacity and perseverance to pursue them, and believing in our own abilities. Hope is a learned process. She said, when we're numbing, we are always living in the place, the belief system that things should be fast and easy. When we are developing this resilient spirit, when we're looking and developing hope, this is the place where we really start to achieve our goals, because we are willing to feel the negative emotions that will come up from them. And the way I think about emotions, and I think I wanted to touch on this really quick because it's a skill that I teach my clients that I think every human on the planet needs. Emotions are like a bell curve where they will come on really strong and you'll be at the peak of this. This is the part where you will go to numb, where you will start looking at your phone. There is an emotion that you're not wanting to feel. And the way she describes it in the book is it's like every emotion, even positive ones, surprisingly, it's like the prick of the tip of the thorn, where it's almost painful to sit here to our brain. And so our brain will start doing other behaviors to get out of it. But when you feel the emotion all the way through, when you feel the waves start to come down, when you stay with it long enough and talk to your body all the way through it, this is when you will start to come down. This is when you develop that resilient spirit. This is where you live from a place of hope. So I want you to get really clear on that if you find yourself numbing, if you are thinking you're reaching your goals fast enough or they're too hard, it's because there is some emotions that you have underneath the surface that your body wants to get out of as fast as possible. So in order for you, well, and the other thing she talks about is you can't numb negative emotions without numbing positive emotions. So if you want to live a joyful, happy existence, you will also feel pain and suffering at some point. Having the contrast of the two is how we appreciate the other and how we know and feel and exist through this human experience, really. So really recognize that in order to cultivate this resilient spirit, to embrace your imperfections, you've got to be very comfortable feeling emotions. And this is something I work with my clients on every single time we meet. Please reach out to me. If you find yourself really having a lot of questions about this, I want to make sure you get your questions answered, because this is a skill that will change your life. So the other ones that she talks about, and I'm not going to write them down, I'm just going to go through them because we're not going to spend as much time on them. But she talks about joy and gratitude. She says it's time for us to just drop the phrase attitude of gratitude. She's like, I'm going to be totally grateful for the things I have, but I don't get up off the couch. I think how funny that is, because so many of us can do that as well. She says what we need to do is develop a gratitude practice. When we are actively practicing gratitude from that space, that's where we're going to really create positive reactions to the gratitude instead of just thinking happy thoughts. And she said there's, from that joy and gratitude, cultivating that, it's learning how to love and see the beauty in the ordinary moments of life. And that ordinary doesn't mean meaningless. Ordinary means extraordinary in so many different aspects. So the fifth one, she talks about intuition and trust. She says every brain is programmed to want certainty. That's where it thinks if it's something certain, then there's not as many negative emotions. But life isn't certain. And when we're always seeking that certainty, that's where we start to silence and not trust ourselves. We silence our intuition. She said, you will know if you feel vulnerable about making a decision is if you are constantly asking other people what their opinion is on things and not trusting yourself to make that decision. The next one she talks about is cultivating creativity. She says, only people who use there's not creative people and non-creative people. And I know this from experience because I used to tell people that I'm just not creative. She said that doesn't exist. She said there's only people that use their creativity and those that don't. And if you are saying you're not a creative person, it's because you are living from a place of comparison. And I can fully see that within myself, that I was too afraid to do creative things because I didn't think they were good enough. And I was constantly seeing the creativity of other people. That was really challenging for me. So if you want to embrace your creativity, it goes back to letting go of what other people think and moving into and loving your imperfections and who you are as an individual, and releasing that comparison. She talks about the next one is play and rest. And I was thinking about this actually with my 3-year-old. We were talking about how when he used to swing on the playground, she's back. Please wait.
Do you want to have the bowl?
No, please wait. Taylor?
They will come back to pick me up.
Okay. Step out, please. Okay. Go out, please. Okay. So she talks about play and rest. So I was talking about this with my 3-year-old, and he said, when I was little and I would kick my legs like this. I'm like, yeah, I remember when he was on the swing, his little legs were going like this and he didn't go very far. He's like, but now my legs move like this. And I was like, yes, that's like the perfect analogy for every single one of us. When we are actively keeping play and rest as an essential, like, part of who of our existence, of who we are, suddenly we start reaching our goals easier. We start going higher and higher and being more of who we're meant to be. It's like we start finding this flow and this swing that exists there. That is exactly what she's talking about here. She said, when we're able to start reaching our goals on a very deep level, we're able to feel completely different about our lives when we are incorporating play and rest. So then the next one she talks about is cultivating calm and still. She says, anxiety is contagious, but so is calm. This is very important, especially being a mom. If you are an anxious person, and I can very much say that that is for a long time been my default, and I've really been working on that the last couple of years, is my family picks up on that. My kids are acting differently because they are picking up the anxiety from me. So in order to create that calm and still, it's creating that space to feel and being with our emotions. The next one she talks about is meaningful work. She said, we have to cultivate meaningful work. And she said, this is a place where she calls slashes, that we can be multiple, multi-passionate individuals, where we can be a mother and a life coach, that we can be. I love the example that she uses where she met a woman she had purchased some jewelry from this woman and then met her in person. And she said, well, I'm not a real jeweler. I'm a CPA. And she goes, of course you're a real jeweler. I'm wearing your earrings. And so she talked about how we can cultivate that meaningful work, things that we are passionate about. And when that starts to happen, that's when we start finding and answering whatever it is that God is calling us to do, is when we accept that we can live in the land of slashes and like I can be this and that. So the last thing she talks about, and I actually, I really enjoy this one because there's something you should know about me is I can't dance and I love to dance. And laughter has always been one of those things that I try to incorporate every single day. So she says we have to cultivate laughter, song, and dance. And so I'm dyslexic, and with dyslexia is that you really can't rhyme. So when I make up my own songs, my kids know, like my daughter, I don't know if she can hear me right now, but I made up some song in the car the other day, and she was like, Mom, I know you made that song up because it's pretty terrible. I was like, I love your honesty. Thank you. And you're right. It is pretty terrible. So it really gives us an opportunity for laughter, and we can incorporate song and dance. One of the things that I think about, and she mentions this in the book, is that when we dance, it's a full body vulnerability. And most of us will never, a lot of people will never move into that full body vulnerability because they are living in the land of comparison, because they are constantly judging themselves for the way they look and feel. So if you want to try something really interesting and to gauge your level of self-compassion versus comparison, is you can go to your room, lock the door, and turn on music and start dancing. You don't even have to look in the mirror, but watch as you judge yourself as your body starts to move. And when you really let go of what, like, we'll have this thought, like, what are people going to think of me? Nobody's thinking of you. You're in your room, but you're so accustomed to always considering that and blocking yourself out from feeling alive from that place. So really practice. That's one of those ways that you can really practice this guidepost in embracing your imperfections, is to go somewhere and to sing and dance by yourself and practice compassion through that experience. This is one of my actual favorite things to do is in between my client calls, I'll stand up and dance. I'll turn music on and I'll dance right here in my office all by myself. Just because when my body moves, it comes alive. It's just fun and enjoyable to me. Plus, it's really great exercise. So this is the Gifts of Imperfection. This is the full book. I really want to give a couple minutes that we can ask questions, but all of this really comes down to what I truly believe and what I work with my clients on, and that is answering whatever call God is calling you to. I know that you feel something inside of you. Every single person does. And when you slow down long enough and give yourself permission to dream and to feel and work in partnership with God, He will help you embrace your imperfections. That's when you do the greatest good on this planet. That's when you change your life and you really become who you're meant to be. and do the work that he is calling you to do. And I would love to help you do that. So when I work with my clients, we go through this in depth for themselves. We really spend time on getting clear on who they are. We spend time in that discovery phase, getting clear on what their calling even is. Some people don't know, and that's okay. Even if it's just a ringing inside of you, we will figure out what that calling is. The second is really getting clear on how to achieve that while still being the mom that you want to be and not sacrificing your health or the time with your family. The third step is really embracing that person you become. I see this every single day, all day long, where when we start moving into who we're meant to be, we will sabotage ourselves every single time because it feels uncomfortable being in those positive emotions. We work through that so that you can truly embrace who you've become while embracing every relationship that is most important to you. So if that's something you are interested in, here is my website, Lara Johnson Coaching. Make sure Lara is just Lara. There's no U in that. And you can go to that and schedule a consultation from there. So we have a couple minutes. I want to answer any questions. You can go to the chat box. You can even unmute yourself if you'd like to do that. And we can ask questions. And as we do that, I'm going to do a drawing really quick. Okay, so let's see, iPhone. I think, was that Nicole? iPhone right here. You are the big magic winner. So I will actually, I don't know your last name. So if you're comfortable sharing your first and last name or email me, here, I'll write it right here. Lara at Lara Johnson Coaching. Email me if you your address, or if you prefer an audiobook, and I will send you Big Magic in the mail. So yes, we've got iPhone over here, the winner. I think that's Nicole based on your comment earlier. So anybody have any questions? Okay, so you did, okay, you're still here, you can hear that. No, it's totally fine. I just want to make sure. Normally I'll reach out to people because I can see first and last name, so I can reach out to them, but I can't do that for you. So just email me right here so I can get you Big Magic. Does anybody have any questions, anything that stood out to them, any takeaways that you're going to work on? I'll just give you a couple seconds. Actually, while we do that, I'm going to turn the recording off. So thank you. We will be doing Big Magic next month. I'm excited for that, and I will see you then. So I'm just going to turn recording off.